We come to Art 4, and we need today to look at an aspect of personality called the unconscious. The unconscious has been the prime demon of the 20th century. And there even was, about 30 years ago, a history, the discovery of the unconscious, a history and evolution of dynamic psychiatry. And the author takes back the foundations of an idea of the unconscious back to 1775, where there was an argument between a priest who had become a very great exorcist named Gastner and a scientist who had become very good at a mysterious power. His name was Mesmer, animal magnetism. And they had this great debate in 1775 over what was really behind psychic things. Was it some kind of animal magnetism, or was it some kind of divine energy which you had to deal with as best you could? And out of this, towards the end of the book, the most sophisticated of all of the presenters of the unconscious, Carl Jung, the author has this to say in a couple of sentences about Jung, which is very telling. One characteristic feature of any journey through the unconscious is the occurrence of what Jung called enantiodromia. It's a Greek word, enantiodromia. This term originating with Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher about 100 years before Plato. Enantiodromia means return to the opposite. Certain mental processes are turned at a given point into their opposite, as if through a kind of self-regulation. And then he goes on to point out that this was understood and seen by Jung and Jungians as being archetypal, and all of this is suspect. Every bit of it. For one thing, if you actually read about the unconscious with most people, they will talk about it as this kind of mysterious universe of potential that we don't know about. The perfect contemporary image of the unconscious would be the dark matter in the universe. Or it would be black holes. The realm of black holes and beyond, of dark matter. This would be the late 1990s version of what most of us would understand by unconscious. That it's an unknown ocean that doesn't have any limits. And yet, throughout the whole development of the history and evolution of psychiatry, the unconscious has always had a delimited boundary, a shape. It is a thing. It is very large, but it is a thing. It is a form. And as a form, one could go across the geography of that form. One could skim over the topology of that form. You could enter it, you could go through it, and you could come out of it on the other side. Now, what's peculiar, and you'll see the parallel with black holes, with dark matter, and so forth, is that when you go into the unconscious in this classical way, if you get into it far enough, you will come to a turning point, this enantiodromia. And when you do, you will immediately come out, and what you will come out is the exact opposite to where you went in. It doesn't matter where you go in. It doesn't matter where you come out. Where you come out will be the exact opposite of where you went in, whichever way you want to cut it. And that the journey will be infinite until you reach a turning point. And when you reach the turning point, it's instantly over and you're at the opposite. Now, this particular form is an idea. The unconscious is really an idea. It's not an unknown ocean somewhere that we can't get to, but it is an idea in the mind. So that it exists on a symbolic level. And in fact, all of its functioning is symbolic in terms of a very specific mode of operation, that mode known as integration. And the idea of the unconscious works like any idea. It's a form objectively in the mind. And we've seen from our education that the mind is very objective as the body. So that ideas in the mind are as objective as existential things. And in fact, there are correlations between existential things and ideas or forms in the mind. But we're at a point in our education where we've come to a third kind of objectivity. That third kind of objectivity, provisionally, we're talking about are works of art. They are not things that are existentially there in nature. They are not things that are in somebody's mind, but they are works of art. They are things that exist in the realm of art. This third objectivity gives us a clue. And one of the operative procedures that we've learned to deal with here is that at any given time, we have a frame of reference. I've called it many times a square of attention. We have a frame of reference which allows us to compose our attention into a picture frame which holds in view images, which holds in view, in fact, existential objects and their images, which holds in view, in fact, mental objects one can have within one's frame, within one's square of attention. Mental ideas, images, and natural existential things. We also can have within that frame of reference a different kind of quality, which are not objects, which are not objective. They're very close to images. Those things, quote things, which are there in that frame of reference, which are not objects, but are very close to images, are memories. And memories, like imagination, belong to a very dynamic process and are not at all objective like things are objective or like ideas are objective. So we have two different breeds of stuff that our attention can get. We have objective things, physical and mental, and we have processes in motion like imagery or like memories. The imagination, its play, registers in an objective way in an interior world. We can objectify images by bringing them together into clear mental form. And when we do so, when we're able to make an image in our minds very clearly, let's try an image. Let's all make an image of an orange in our mind. There are no oranges in this room, but we have all seen oranges. And by making an image of an orange in our mind at this particular time, we are using memory. It's not at all imagination, though it seems like imagination. It's really memory. If we're looking at a physical orange, and we are seeing that as an orange, that's an image of the orange. If one were able to go to the level of neurons in the nervous system, there's no orange there. There are only electrical impulses that are there. It's the gestalt, it's the array of these electrical impulses. It's the neuronal cloud that's gestalted, first of all, by imagination, and second of all, by memory, that allows us, in a coordinated way, to see an orange. If we are presented with an object that we have never seen before, we don't immediately see it. Or we see it and recognize that we don't know what it is. What is it? The most startling example that I ever saw when I was teaching in Canada, we got a film from the CBC that somebody had taken of the Inuit people back in the 20s. And there was this group of Eskimos, Inuit people, who were watching a film. And the film was of Toronto, of the downtown skyscraper skyline of Toronto. They were not seeing what was on the screen because they had never seen a city. They had never seen high-rises or buildings. They did not recognize that this was a place where human beings lived by the million. They were also shown images of trees. They had never seen trees in their lives. They didn't know what it was there. Those images were on the screen, but they did not register for those Eskimo peoples. And you could see the camera, the CBC cameraman would show the screen, what was on there, and then they would show the faces of these people. They were blank. They were participating in an activity which was like a whiteout blizzard for them in terms of imagery. They're waiting for it to clear so that they could see what's going on. And you could see in the faces, you could see the women patiently waiting for the stuff to get over so they could get back to work. You could see in the men, them waiting to see what it was that they're supposed to be looking at and getting at. But none of them registered anything that was there. Later, to sort of follow this up, one of the CBC camera people asked the Inuit people who were there to draw a tree. They'd just seen them on the screen. The best versions that they had were these sharp stick figures that looked like some kind of crystalline striation. That was what they thought a tree might be. They'd heard about trees. None of them drew anything at all like what they had just seen on the screen that were trees. All of this is very peculiar when one really steps back and looks at it. But it becomes downright surreal when you look at it from an artistic standpoint. When an artist looks gets at. Not just this kind of perceptual non-registering of the Eskimo people in this particular example, but of the way in which sophisticated so-called European minds do not register anything and call it an unconscious in terms of their own capabilities. So that at the same time that you have people like Freud and Jung and Adler developing very complex therapeutic applications of the idea of the unconscious, you have artists like Kandinsky and Max Ernst who are tearing the whole thing apart. And by the late 20th century, it's quite obvious to someone who has a little maturation and experience that Kandinsky and Ernst are much more sophisticated than people like Freud and Jung vis-a-vis the so-called unconscious. Freud especially gets caught into an integration mode and literally worries it to death. Jung straddles the integral mode and the differential mode and tries to keep his balance in between and hopes the roads don't diverge too much. Whereas people like Ernst and Kandinsky, as examples, the great artists of the 20th century, simply having learned that there's no need to straddle two lines, two camps, or to be in one or isolated in the other also, but that there is a fullness, a complementarity that is what is real. The artists just walk around and do their stuff. They don't worry at all. Whether it's unconscious or whether it's conscious. If someone like Max Ernst were to have a mental breakdown, he would have a field day. A whole new series of paintings. Lead me to it. Somebody like a Kandinsky would have, his only prayer would be able to come back in an even worse condition so he could investigate it better. It's that kind of difference. The artist works in a very objective way, but the objective stuff for the artist is his person, is her person. And their person registers accurately in real works of art, such that those works of art have their person presented there. So that it was a very common kind of artistic play in the 1930s. One example, just to give you an example of how this was, one of the great literary artists of the working in the 20s and 30s was in Spain. His name was Miguel de Unamuno. His name means literally one world. Is ultimately real. Miguel de Unamuno, Spain's greatest existential philosopher, but also her greatest novelist since Cervantes. And at the end of Unamuno's novels, he would have these appendixes where the characters from the novels would come in and demand of the author that he write more stories about them. You've created us, and we now have existential rights. And were you not to write further stories about us, you would be guilty of our murder. And Unamuno, as an artist, came to agree with them. That his characters were right and that their existential rights were in fact as real as his own. He has in fact, a whole series of essays around this particular issue, and he centers it upon Cervantes' Don Quixote. He says one place, he says that for us, Don Quixote is as real as any man who ever lived in the 1500s. In fact, more real. It's very difficult for us to get to know some man in the 1500s, but when we read Cervantes, we get to know Don Quixote. And because we get to know Don Quixote, we really get to know Cervantes. We get to know the feel of the man. We get to recognize the play of his personality. We finally become acquainted enough with him, such that a writer like William Faulkner said one time in an interview, he said, well, I spend a couple of hours with my friends every once in a while, like Cervantes or Balzac, because I prefer their company. It was an interview when he was here in Hollywood working on film scripts for Howard Hawks. And somebody asked him if he liked the life with the movie stars, and he said he'd rather spend time with Cervantes and Balzac. They were better people. I think the only exception was at one time I learned from Faulkner's lady friend that Faulkner, Howard Hawks, Clark Gable, and Humphrey Bogart all went out duck hunting down around the Salton Sea. And they took 2 or 3 cases of scotch, and they came back with no ducks and no scotch. Artists have a peculiar quality that they enjoy the world in which they are real. They live objectively in the world that they are making. So that a Jungian psychiatrist of extreme capability, Erich Neumann, in writing about art from a Jungian standpoint, has a series of articles brought together in the book called Art and the Creative Unconscious. So now we have to modify it. There's a creative unconscious. What's the difference between an uncreative consciousness and a creative consciousness? And right away, if one is schooled, if one is learned, if one has a little bit of background, in fact, it takes a lot of background. In philosophy, you recognize that this was a medieval issue about 1,000 years ago. The great Carolingian Renaissance philosopher John Scotus Eriugena in the 900s wrote a huge tome about the difference between the uncreated and the created. And that there were mediums where it was partially created and partially uncreated, but in 2 different ways, with the created taking a little bit of emphasis, but still a lot of uncreated, or the uncreated taking a little emphasis with a lot of the created, and that you had a 4-fold kind of typology. This was in the 900s. When you come to Jung's really great volume, Analytical Psychology, the only book before this was the year before Psychological Types. Analytical Psychology, 1922, collected essays. When you come to the last couple of chapters, Psychology of the Unconscious Processes, the Conception of the Unconscious, and you come to the very end of the book, the very end of the chapter, the essay on the conception of the unconscious, comes here to a summary. And it sounds like John Scotus Eriugena, 1,000 years before, the pinnacle of early medieval philosophy. Honest to God, it reads like this. I am not making this up. This is Carl Jung. He's a very intelligent man. He slid into an envelope of time travel mentally. He thought he was looking at the future, and he was just there millennium before. The composition of the persona. The conscious personal contents constitute the conscious personality, the conscious ego. The unconscious personal contents constitute the self, the unconscious or subconscious ego. The conscious and unconscious contents of a personal nature together constitute the persona. And then there are these two emphases where you have a little bit more consciousness or a little more unconsciousness, and you have the same kind of typology. One would like to ask what is going on here. I remember for decades reading Jung with great joy because I started when I was 17 trying to understand him, and it took me until I was like in my late 20s, early 30s to be able to triumphantly read a page and say, oh, I got that page. And it comes as quite a shock now to be able to read it and say, what millennium is that from? The difficulty is that without the way in which the phase form development of our education goes, there's no way to get a frame of reference which also has its unframed contextualization, where both are operative. It's tantamount to someone not being able to see beyond the frame limits and to be always lost in the picture. To never understand that what you're looking at is only a picture that's within a room, and that this room is within nature, and that nature is within a whole universe, and that all of these contexts together, along with the picture, constitute what is real. That there's no way, on the basis of any picture, no matter how good or how comprehensive, you can understand what's real. I had a friend, Emmett Grogan, who was the founder of the Diggers and the Givers of Free Food in the 60s. And he was an apprentice cameraman originally to Antonioni. And he said Antonioni used to carry around with him a little 35 millimeter slide without the slide, just the frame. And he would constantly, like a nervous habit, take this out and look at stuff through this frame of reference, through this slide, to keep himself in tone so that he could see in terms of what the camera was actually going to pick up. And constantly factoring in what the camera would pick up with what the camera did not pick up, which was also a part of an artist's realm. So that when you look at an Antonioni film, what you are seeing is a very small tip of the iceberg of actually what is real and what is happening. And a lot of people feel bored by watching something like Red Desert and watching the characters in this kind of Greek tragedy, slow motion, this kind of no drama, slow motion going through these agonizing, neurotic, emotional sufferings until you begin to look at it in terms of Antonioni's art. And all of a sudden, there's too much to experience because you yourself are brought into play. Your seeing of Antonioni's pictures is a part of the reality of what is happening there. Talk about our audience participation. Any real great artist involves his audience with the work. The work of art comes alive when it is experienced. The audience is a part of the work of art. An artist has already taken that into consideration, has made it in that way. Such that every time someone approaches a Rembrandt canvas, Rembrandt is there in that painting originally, right now. Every single time. Even like a couple of years ago when the Getty were showing off their two new Rembrandts, and they were so poorly lit that you couldn't see them from any kind of focal length that Rembrandt would have recognized. You had to sort of get up real close to them because they were so mislit. There was enough of an opportunity to experience Rembrandt again. The frizzled-haired joy of the madman realist who was just simply there again, doing it. Every brush stroke giving this flavor, this dynamic. The browns sliding into shades of ochre that were undescribable and emerging again as a kind of a gold that all of a sudden was really light and it wasn't a color at all. And the art showing that a human portrait thrives on this kind of spectrum that is differential rather than integral. You don't get a Rembrandt by coming to a conclusion about it. You get a Rembrandt because you realize you could look at it forever and it would never, ever be exhausted. In the existential aesthetic of someone like a Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he says the proof of a work of art is that you realize finally that you cannot exhaust its dimensional possibilities. You could come back to it whenever, forever. And it would be there with you, ready to explore again new capacities. How many times have you heard Beethoven's Sixth Symphony? How many times could you hear it? In aesthetic terms, there's no limitation to it. And yet, there are unnumbered human beings who would not hear any kind of melodic line listening to the Sixth Symphony. They would not hear any symphonic form whatsoever. And it's true that it takes a practice. Kandinsky, in his Concerning the Spiritual of Art, talks about how the melodic and the symphonic are characteristics not only of music, but of painting also, of all art, architecture, sculpture. And he has this to say. This is his conclusion, as opposed to a Jungian type conclusion. This is a Kandinsky conclusion. Simple composition, which is regulated according to an obvious and simple form, this kind of composition I call melodic. There's a simple form that's doing the differentiating. Complex composition consisting of various forms subjected more or less completely to a principal form. The principal form may be hard to detect, and by the same token it increases inner resonance. This kind of composition I call symphonic. This kind of principal form for Kandinsky is very similar and yet totally different from an archetype in Jungian psychology. One of Jung's favorite little phrases, somebody asked him about archetypes once, and he said they're a problem. You don't have archetypes, they have you. They're larger than you are. They subsume you. And yet the Faustian urge in a Jungian analysis is to encompass the archetypal realm. To enlarge yourself to such an extent that you can have them in you. And of course, the peril of an analysis is that one gets inflated. This is Jung's term. You get puffed up, you get inflated by trying to have a personal dimension large enough to encompass an archetypal form. Whereas in someone like a Max Ernst, he's like an acrobat in terms of these conflicts. He does full pirouettes mid-air, holding on to nothing, no net. Because when you come to someone, let's shift over to Ernst for a moment. By the early 1920s, Ernst he was born in 1891, so he was approaching 30 years of age. He got completely caught up in the very quality of nightmare that Jung also was caught up in. It was called the World War I. World War I was a total nightmare. When you come, for instance, to Jung's preface of his book, Analytical Psychology, it's a totally different tone than you have in the conclusion of this. Let me read it from my excerpts here on the notes. Jung writes, the psychological events that accompany the present war, it's being written in 1917, the war is still going on. The psychological events that accompany the present war, the incredible brutalization of public opinion, the epidemic of mutual calamities, the unsuspected mania for destruction, the unexampled flood of mendacity, and man's incapacity to arrest the bloody demon, are they not, one and all, better adapted than anything else to force obtrusively the problem of the chaotic unconscious, which slumbers uneasily beneath the ordered world of consciousness, before the eyes of every thinking individual? This war has inexorably shown to the man of culture that he is still a barbarian. But Jung goes even further. He says that there is a direct correspondence between individuals and nations. And just as individuals have this chaotic unconscious at their levels, nations also have a chaotic unconscious. And sure enough, just a little over 10 years later, World War II broke out, which dwarfed World War I. The brutalization of World War I was nothing compared to the brutalization of World War II. Jung's essay came out of a deep archetypal dream he had that the god Wotan had resented being left out of civilized German consciousness and demanded archetypally to take over the mind again. So that the barbarity of the individual in World War I was followed by the barbarity of nations going chaotically unconscious in World War II. But what was even scarier, Jung also alluded here to the fact that there was a very deep universal archetypal level that engulfed not only individuals and nations, but the entire universe. This is the Gnostic Jung. That there is a barbarity underneath the universe's order. And this was the terror of World War III. World War III, that actually did happen, did occur. But that its battlefields were not in the individual going crazy, or in nations going crazy in terms of geological location, but in terms of the universe's reality going crazy in terms of its totalness. All of these are issues, all of these are levels which Kandinsky and Ernst took on together and made a differentiation of. We'll come back after the break and take a further look at this, but I want to close this opening with something like this. If you have a square of attention, in order for a new phase to come into that square of attention, the most distant past phase slides out of attention, not out of existence, but for want of a better word, becomes subconscious or contextual to the square of attention. As consciousness begins to play, nature goes out of play in terms of one's square of attention. As the artist comes into play, the next phase, ritual, goes subconscious, to the extent that the artist, one's own person, enters into the frame of reference, one's bodily existence becomes subconscious. That experience, the first experience of an objectivity, in fact, a very important objectivity, one's body is sliding into subconsciousness, is interpreted by the ego as a death, as a madness, as a real peril. And what the ego says is, we're not going to become artists. We're going to stay here and stay real. The artists are enemies, and art is suspect. In fact, the most heavily organized band of egos that the world has ever known, the Nazi Party, outlawed modern art. They said people like Ernst and Kandinsky are enemies of the state. Let's take a break. This quality of our education, of allowing us to navigate, it's actually like a navigation. The structure of the phases of our education allow us to move across an ocean and be a part of that ocean, wherever we are on it, and keep our navigational capacity, because we never have the neurotic need to have the boat and the ocean be one. We're glad to have them be what they are. We're glad that our ship that we're navigating in floats, and we're glad that the ocean isn't a part of the ship. It would be a sunken wreck if it were. So differentiation is quite distinct from an integration mode, and an integration mode that we get stuck in fact, stuck to the extent that we fear differentiation, almost automatically becomes dangerous. Let's try to say it in a different way. Let's try to say it in squares of attention. We're talking about how, if you look at the sequencing of our phases, when nature comes into its full play, its full square of attention, the complete integration cycle, nature, ritual, myth, and symbol are all in play, and they're all there, and they integrate. And if you take those aspects of nature and ritual and myth and symbol, you can integrate them. You can bring them together. You can make an integration in forms that are as permanent as physical bodies. Once you understand the idea of an equation, and you understand the notion of number like 2, and you understand the mathematical notion of plus, 2 plus 2 equals 4 is an eternal form. It's always good. In any universe where plus, where number, and where equality choreographed together as mathematical certainties, 2 plus 2 equals 4, will hold. But the differential process is not concerned with holding on to exclusively the integration mode. So right away when you cross a threshold into the differential side of reality, as soon as you take one step there, you've lost a step. Where have you lost a step? You've lost a step in nature. And as you progress into the differential mode of vision, as that becomes operative in your square of attention, nature becomes less and less notable. It's less and less there. It still is there as nature, but it's less there in your attention. So that one of the designations that used to hold about vision, about the phase of vision, was that it was supernatural. It was magic. And as the world of magic comes into play, the world of nature seems to go out of play. As you factor in the world of the supernatural more and more, the world of the natural is, to that extent, not factored in. Yes, in reality it's still there, but it's not in your square of attention. So there is a circumspect kind of jitteriness among all natural individuals, all natural peoples, about magic, about the supernatural. They respect it and treat it with respect, but they would rather not have it impinge. And if they have to, they would rather have protection rather than facility. And if somebody has facility, they want to see on their good side. On the tribal level, there are very few medicine men or medicine women. Even on tribal level, the idea of going on a weekend retreat to become a shaman is ludicrous. It's not something you want to play with at all. You'd like to stay away from that. Because to the extent that you play in that realm, you lose the process of nature as an assumable ally. Because one of the functions of a square of attention is that as it maintains its actuality is maintained by a polarizing process. It maintains form by polarization. And this is why consciousness as a process, why vision as a process, why magic as a process, the supernatural as a process, is so fraught with perils and difficulties. Because one is losing the gratis participation and certainty of nature. What replaces it? Where nature was the baseline for that square of attention, now ritual. It moves up to the next phase. So that the certainty in an inexperienced consciousness is ritual magic. Ritual-based magic. Let's burn some candles. Let's do a horoscope. Let's read the tarot cards. Let's find somebody who can deliver a blessing or a curse. Let's get close to a priest. Let's get close to a witch doctor, a witch, a medicine man, all of this sort of thing. We need an astrologer. We need teaching. But that realm where ritual is the base and vision is the furthest, you have ritual, myth, symbol, and vision. Those problems, great as they are minuscule compared to the problems of the next phase coming into play, the phase of art, the phase of the objective person. Because the person's objectivity is in a differential way, not in an integral way. No one ever found their personal integration. If the integration process is mastered to its nth degree, what you have is super yogi who blinks out of the concern for needing to worry about it. They're not artists. Artist is a totally different kind of objectivity from a yogi. Occasionally there are yogis who become artists. The most famous yogi who became an artist is in India, Valmiki. Valmiki's name means white anthill. Valmiki used to be able to hold a samadhi so long that the white ants would build their hovel, their hill, over him. You know, you come out of a samadhi after 30 or 40 years, well, you shake off the white ant hill and go find another place to sit. The only yogi that ever matched Valmiki and his ability to concentrate the integral process to refine nature to an nth degree of vanishing was Milarepa, who also became an artist, incidentally. Valmiki became the author of the Ramayana, and Milarepa became the author of 100,000 poems. The way Valmiki discovered that he was an artist was he was in that deep samadhi one day, and a hunter in the forest with a bow and arrow shot a bird, a beautiful bird, that had been a part of that forest for as long as it had lived, had been a part of the absorbed tapestry of integration of Valmiki's reality. And when the bird was killed, that beautiful aspect of that forest was suddenly dead and gone. Without thinking, he cursed the hunter. And of course, because he had a century of tapas energy, as soon as he uttered the curse, the guy was like worse than toast. He was like a little wisp of soot that blew in the breeze and settled onto the ground. And so he came out of the samadhi, and he, being a good yogi, he fixed the form of the language in his yogic mind, and he looked at the curse. And he noticed that the curse had a particular form. It had a language form. It had a linguistic shape. It had a polarized shape because all such items will have a polarity. That's how they hold their structure. Things don't exist without positive and negative. You can't have objectivity without positive and negative. And so the language form, instead of staying in the mythic, had jumped the track because of his yogic integration. It had nowhere to be in the integration process. It had jumped over to the differential mode. So it wasn't mythic language, but it also wasn't symbolic language. And because it had registered, it wasn't in the visionary mode, it had registered in the objectivity of the art realm. And he found that the language that they used, Sanskrit, had an archetypal, artistic form in its language. The couplet, they call it in Sanskrit the sloka, that all deeply felt utterance that comes completely through the transformed center of integration into the differential registers as a polarized form in art. And that's the poetic form. And the poetic form of Sanskrit is the sloka. And that if you begin expressing feeling and thought and vision in the sloka form, you will have a linking together, and eventually the form that came out, he told a story, the deepest story that he could, and that was the Ramayana, which is many tens of thousands of slokas. And that's how the poetic form in Sanskrit was made. He was the first artist in the language of Sanskrit. There's a world of difference between the Rig Veda, which is a ritual form put into mythic language, and Valmiki's Ramayana, which is an artistic form of visionary language. When you read Rig Veda, you read hymns that have a ritual comportment, and only when you're internalizing them completely do you realize that what comes out then is a ritual comportment. The internalization of the Rig Veda leads to the caste system. That's what comes out. If you internalize the Ramayana, you find that you can't internalize it. You have to externalize yourself in order to participate in the realm where the Ramayana is real. And when you do so, you discover that your person now is differentiated enough to be able to see that there's an even more comprehensive differential form called the cosmos, which you're aligned with. Just the mind integrally is allied with the body, the person is allied with the cosmos. And what a work of art does is it shows you that you're at home in the universe, which is now conscious. The work of art exists objectively in a conscious cosmos. It isn't a neutral flow of nature that one could Zen-like come to participate with in a completely neutral way. A Japanese Zen yogi can be with nature in a completely neutral way because one synthesizes the positive and negative perfectly, and you come out with dead zero. It takes a really good yogi to do it, but you can do it. You can come out with dead zero. What happens to the image base when you come out with dead zero? Well, the Japanese, being Japanese, one of their great yogic artists, his name was Takuan, made a sequence of exactly what happens. He made 10 pictures in a row in a sequence. They're called the 10 Bulls. Did this about 300 years ago. In the first picture, there's the bull. And then through the sequences, there's you finding the bull, tracking it down, learning how to tame it, learning how to ride it, going places with it, then realizing that you and the bull are one, and that you and the bull as one and the landscape are one. And when you start aligning all those ones, you come to the 9th picture in Takuan's 10 Bulls, and the 9th picture is blank. Because when all of those are aligned, they are dead even zero. There's no polarization. There's no preference one way or the other ever exactly. And what records is shunyata, the sound of one hand clapping. Nil. But the 10th picture in Taquin's 10 Bulls is you having gone back to town to enjoy your life again. Looks exactly like the first one, only the complete cycle has gone through. Only now, instead of being in the integral mode, you're there in a sense of complementarity. You're at home both in the natural universe and in the conscious cosmos all at the same time. The artist is the first level of objectivity where one gets a glimpse of the real. That the body is not the only objective thing, nor is the body and the mind together the only objective things. That the artistic personality is also objective as they are, but in a differential mode. Instead of wanting to come further together, because one has already come together as much as can be. Now you're interested in exploring new possibilities. What the artist wants is something new. Someone asked Faulkner one time, what was his favorite novel? He said, oh my dear, the next one. The artist is ready for something else. If you ever saw the film of The Horse's Mouth with Alec Guinness, the archetypal artist, Gully Jimson, the end of the film, he's grumbling, he's on his houseboat that he's cut loose going down the Thames River, and he's had it with all the complications of life, and he's ready for nothing, and all of a sudden he looks up and he sees this huge side of a boat that's blank, and his thumb goes up to size it up for a painting. The next one, whatever it is. The artist finds that he's at home in a cosmos of infinite possibilities. That's where he's at home. That's where she wants to live. She wants to live in complete and utter openness. That's quite different from the tribal person who fears the magician, much less the artist. The fear of magic is nothing compared to the perilous trepidation of art on level of ego. Why? Because as art comes into play, ritual goes out of play. And if you've been depending on ritual all the time for your sense of certainty, magic threatens nature, but art threatens your ritual certainty. Artists are the ultimate heroic enemies of ritual certainty. A really great artist does away completely with the ritual comportment, out of the square of attention. Where is the basis then of the artist's square of attention? Their basis is on the mythic level. Not the level of the body, but the level of experience. They're concerned with keeping the basis there in their experience, in their language, of keeping their feelings healthy. Because the feeling-toned experience of the mythic level is where they have their square of attention founded. They're not interested anymore in what the animals are doing. They're not interested in what the ritual codes say you should be doing. They're interested in what they can explore with their works of art, keeping their feelings and their thoughts and their intuition together with their exploration as what we would call a human being. So that art is a very interesting phase. It's not just about pretty things that go on walls or collections that are made by kind of peculiar people or by regular people in peculiar moments. That's not what art is about. It's not about that at all. It's an extraordinary way of recutting what someone thought was the final form. Because in the integral process, the final form is the mind. But what the artist does is he recuts the mind and transforms it into a jewel. The beauty of the jewel is not that it's dead zero blank nothing at its core, but that it scintillates differentially the light into new possibilities and capacities. So that for the artist looks forward to the phrase in the meditative tradition of India was that the differential prism of the artistic person looks forward to exploring the jewel matrix cosmos. That's what they're interested in. They don't want to stay at home in the tribe. They don't want to stay at home in the ritual comportment. They don't want to just be limited to those kinds of things. And it's not always polite. Every person who comes to their own differentiation understands that there are times when you have to just kick through the walls. You have to color outside the lines. When he got the Nobel Prize for Literature, Juan Ramon Jimenez said, if they give you ruled paper, write the other way. You have to have that kind of courage. It's a courage that is more rare than physical courage. In fact, it's a courage that's more rare than mental courage. Physical courage comes on the mythic level. Physical courage is knowing what can happen to your body and you still dare it. More difficult than that, higher than that, is conscious courage because you know what can happen to your mind and you still think it. But artistic courage occurs not on art, but on the process that comes after it, which is history. Artists know damn well, as the phrase goes, what happens to them and works of art when they're ground up into this even more perilous differential process. More perilous than consciousness is history. So the joys of the artist are matched by the perils of the artist. I can see it. They can see that before they get to explore the jewel matrix cosmos, they've got to deal with this ocean of history. Not that it's an ocean geographically, but that it's a process, like vision, like myth, like nature, that has to be navigated. And the difficulty is that you don't navigate it in an integral form, but you navigate it in differential forms. And so you have to really learn how to make differential forms that float on history in order to deal with it. And that's very hard to do. That is not easy at all. And consequently, the easiest way, 99.99% of the time, instead of going ahead with exploration, going further into the differential realm, one recursively comes back and you regress. You reduce it down. I'm going to cut my losses. I go back where it's secure. And the very first stage of regression is that you give up the objectivity of the person and you go back to depending upon ritual. You go back depending upon the body. Geez, I better take care of my body. It sounds so good. It's a lure. Yes, you need a healthy body, but to make that decision instead of going ahead with the differential adventure of your own person, vis-a-vis the historical process, one goes back and right away ritual has a familiar certainty. Oh, I know this well. Of course you know it well. But going back to ritual is not enough, because the real foundations of ritual, the real activity of ritual, where it has its traction, is back in nature. And when you get really reductively and regressively immersed back in ritual, it's very easy to want to get natural again. The health of the body, we got to get it back into nature. Again, very alluring. What's going to drop out of your frame of reference? Consciousness. I'm going to go back to nature. I don't want to think about it. Yes. Billions of people have said this, have believed this, have done this. And it's very difficult to reverse a regression. Why? Because those achievements that were there, that were quite real, now become antagonists by virtue of your receding from them, so that your own person now becomes the source of resistance and difficulty. No wonder you are your own worst enemy. Because your own worst enemy is really you, but you on a differential level. No wonder it's so incredible as a saboteur. How can it be that exactly at the right wrong moment, every time this happens, how can this be? Because your adversary knows you well. Your adversary is you. What are you going to do? Remember Unamuno, writing his novels, and then the characters come in demanding more scripts. The work of art demands of you that you continue. Well, you didn't continue, you're guilty of murder. Why would your higher self sabotage you? Because you're guilty. That's why. Jean-Paul Sartre has the flies gathered around, the flies of guilt gathered around, because the guy is a stench of his own possibility of consciousness that he's regressed, and they're not going to leave him. In fact, there are more all the time because he keeps regressing. This kind of a concern. If you're clever and you manage to maintain an even keel and you manage to keep down to neutrality so that the regression isn't too much, but that you're right on the verge of consciousness and you get into this neutrality, then you have Camus' The Stranger. You have this absurdity where everything is kind of neutral, sort of provisionally wobbles back and forth, and it's like a nausea. It's an absurdity that quickly you get disgusted and tired of, and yet you don't want to upset it too much. How does The Stranger begin? My mother died today, or was it yesterday? Or you get this artistic figure in The Plague, Le Peste, the journalist who wants to write the great novel of Europe, and he can never get past the first sentence because he knows he's got to polish the first sentence exactly, and so he keeps rewriting it year after year after year. So the clever neutrality of absurdity gets you at a wavering dead evenness that's very precarious, and all of your creative ingenuity goes to keeping yourself hovering just a little above or a little below zero, just so you don't get neutered out, which is death, which would be murder. Camus says that on an individual level, it's suicide, but on a sociological level, it's murder. So when he investigates the individual level, the absurdity, the philosophic investigation of it for The Stranger is The Myth of Sisyphus, his book, his essay on that. But the sociological level, where it's murder, he examines that in his book, The Rebel. The myth of Sisyphus is about suicide. Suicide of trying to maintain a neutrality where the ego is not allowed to regress too much, but also isn't let go of. Vis-a-vis the rebel, where the problem is not suicide, but murder to others. We knew all along, you knew all along, they were to blame. It stands to reason it couldn't have been you, right? It's them. So an existentialist like Martin Heidegger develops a whole precarious phenomenology of the they self. Or as he says in the English translation, the throne aspect. Not just projected, it's not polite at all. It's like vomited, full force. The throne aspect of your non-personal, non-ego that's threatening you with this anxiety, this angst, is luring you because the issue is always that you're trying to be. And yet, how you're trying to be, where you're trying to be, what you're trying to be is always wavering, and if it didn't waver, it would blank out. So one gets caught in this horrendous nightmare of torrential impossibility. What's the phrase? Every which way is wrong. No wonder you get angry. Who wouldn't? No wonder you get disgusted. Who wouldn't? No wonder you're joyful to find someone or something to blame. No wonder you're completely depressed when you finally figure out that it's you. You skip to the last page and you read it, you done it. It's disheartening. What's the way to go? The only way to go is for the differential person to come into play enough that you wean yourself away from the addictive taste of ritual certainty. And the happy realization that it's still there, it just isn't in your square of attention. The body is still there. Artists still have bodies. And they're still taken care of. It's just that the addictive quality of needing to be certain that it's there is gone. Or lessened enough so it doesn't dominate one's attention. But sure enough, to the extent that that happens, one is able to turn around, one is able to make this shift, this metanoia. And you see that the problem, the real problem that's there before you, is not that you were addicted to candle burning rituals or something like that. The real problem is that you're in a historical mess that you have to deal with. Because it is there. It is happening. It's ongoing. The fortunate thing is now you have some kind of navigational form that's appropriate to that challenge. So what is the person's concern? To understand, to investigate, to explore their person. Get better acquainted with the ship. To use an old simile, to figure out how the rigging works, make sure the sails are mended, the rudder's in there, and that you can go. Just knowing how to navigate is not enough. You have to keep it ship-shape. So the artist is always exploring their person. Not their ego, but their person. They explore their ego as a part of the square of attention, which is more or less there at some kind of basic beginning, but that the real import of it is the differential possibilities that are opening up. So our education turns out to be exactly that, an education. It has nothing to do with a theology. It has nothing to do with a psychology. Psychologies are as primitive as theologies. And one asks then, what does an unconscious look like to an artist? An artist says it's a new page. It's a new work. It's ready to go. When we come to someone like Kandinsky, he writes this. There are three different sources of inspiration. A direct impression of nature expressed in purely pictorial form. This I call an impression. In fact, Kandinsky, in expressing this, is very aware, because he's writing this some 2 generations after the initial explorations of this by geniuses like Monet, who's a real universal genius, by the way. Monet's understanding of impression in terms of art is extremely sophisticated. Kandinsky is doing homage here, saying, yeah, there's that level. And we'll talk about Impressionism later on. Not today, but another day. 2, a largely unconscious, spontaneous expression of inner character. Non-material nature. I call this, he says, an improvisation. Before the child can speak, the child has to play around with gibberish to get the tongue and the larynx and all of this used to making sounds that are shaped. You have to have gibberish before you can sing. You don't need it to yell, but you do to talk. So too, the actor cannot play a role in a drama until they have worked on themselves, improvisations. 3rd, writes Kandinsky, an expression of a slowly formed inner feeling, tested, worked over repeatedly, and almost pedantically. This I call a composition. Reason, consciousness, purpose play an overwhelming part. But of calculation, nothing appears, only feeling. You have to understand here that feeling is intelligent. Feelings are as intelligent as thought. In her essay on one of her early essays on art, Suzanne Langer, one of the century's greatest philosophers, writes perceptively, she says, I'm scouting the possibility that thought is an elaboration of feeling. And only when feeling is intelligent does thought become intelligent. And to the extent that one has a smooth move between feeling and thought, does the intelligence have this kind of spread enough to be able to do something artistically. And sure enough, one looks at an artist in any field whatsoever, part of their exploration and their concern always is to keep the fluid interplay of thought and feeling. To not let thought dominate feeling, not let feeling dominate thought, but to, like 2 wings, that the intelligence of the artist spreads with thought and feeling equally, and that's how they fly. How else would they fly in the realm of visionary consciousness? If you fly by thought alone, you're just fodder waiting for somebody who really shapes an archetypal form to thought enough and catches you in some ideology. You're a waiting pigeon for the first totalitarian idea that sweeps you off your mental feet. The most poignant volume of political criticism written since Machiavelli is The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. He says the fanatic is willing to die for their cause, but what's insidious is they're willing that you die for their cause also. Hoffer also adds, they're on the move everywhere in our age. When I interviewed Eric Hoffer in San Francisco, it was interesting because he was a longshoreman. He didn't have a chair in philosophy. He was a longshoreman on the docks in San Francisco. He used to wear plaid flannel shirts and big glasses, and is very muscular in his way of just practical thinking. Let's see this how it is and think this through. And one of the days I was there interviewing him, I had talked to Paul Goodman just a few hours before. And Goodman's a professor from Columbia and very sophisticated. And he was trying to look like an undergraduate with his running clothes, his floppy flannel pants and floppy sweatshirt and unmussed hair, and talking colloquially. Here, Hoffer, the working man, has hair all combed, and, his shirt arranged, and wears suits, and is trying to show that this is a serious, excuse the gender reference, but it was a manly procedure to talk seriously about these problems, that these were real problems. For Goodman, they were conversational items to be in the mood of stuff. This is what we're talking about, because our age is interested in these things. Later we'll talk about something else that becomes of interest. There's a kind of a glibness. Whereas there's a kind of poignancy to Hoffer. He was someone for whom these things had been discovered individually out of midnight reading when you're tired from your work, and over the years it occurred to them, these are very serious issues. My God, this is what's going on. No wonder we're upset. No wonder we're fearful. We have every right to be, because there are fearful and upsetting conditions that are loose around us all the time. And not only threaten us from without, but sequester us from within without our permission, without us even knowing that it's happened. Hoffer's book after The True Believer is called The Ordeal of Change. The hardest thing in the world is to change. Because the only way that you can change as a person is through the alchemy of vision. The ego changes by redistributing mechanically its ritual certainty. Burns a different kind of candle. Oh, we burnt the candle on the new moon, we have to burn it on the full moon. It mechanically redistributes, whereas the person who's going to change in terms of consciousness has to transform. It isn't just the repositioning of mechanical items at all. That has nothing to do with the situation. The true problem is not the positioning of ritual items at the right time. The true fact is that those 1,000 tanks coming over this range of hills are coming because of an ideological seizure, that they're the master race and you're fodder. You've got to do something practical about that. And one of the keys, like Francis Ford Coppola put in the screenplay patent, is that the matured person who can deal with history understands someone who is ritually bound better than they do himself. Coppola has a patent when he first has the American tanks engage the Nazi tanks at Kasserine, and they defeated them. And Patton's comment was, "Rommel, you beautiful son of a bitch, I read your book." A Nazi is hypnotized by the ritual splendor of the right way to the extent that they do not see that somebody creative will do an end run around them. If they know exactly what you're going to do and how you do it, an artist becomes capable of outdoing you in your own terms. Where do you think the poignancy of an Ibsen comes from, that it can characterize middle-class society 100 years ago so accurately that middle-class people today cringe when they look at an Ibsen play? More next week.